The FTX Crypto Cup has just begun today, and we just saw a really exciting game between Magnus Carlsen and Anish Giri. This is a rapid game, and it's one of these esports games where the players are sitting in front of each other, but they're both actually playing on a computer. It's a rapid game. It's 15 minutes with a small increment, and we just saw this really fascinating game between Magnus Carlsen and Anish Giri. It was a Sicilian defense, and we right away get to the Najdorf. And here, of course, there are many different approaches for white to play. But Magnus in this game decided to play this very interesting move, rook to g1, which is known as the freak attack. And it's obviously a very crude way of continuing. If you've never seen it before, it might be a bit jarring, like, what the heck, why are you just moving your rook? But the point is very simple. You just want to play g4 and you want to go for a massive kingside attack right away. And also what was interesting about this is we get to see what Anish Giri has cooked up against this interesting variation. He's obviously a bit of an expert on the Najdorf, and you might be expecting, okay, maybe he'll play pawn to e5. This is kind of the main line, very typical for any Najdorf position, or maybe there's some pawn to b5. These are kind of the normal moves, but no. He decides to play pawn to h5, which is a little bit of a rarer move, but it's obviously aimed at defending against white's plan. And if you put your rook on g1, your plan was to play g4, so white says, okay. Black says, okay, you can't do that anymore. Let's just put an end to it. So Magnus decides to put his bishop on g5, filling this hole that was created when h5 was played, because now there's no h6, you can't kick the bishop away. So he just plugs his guy in, and now we see pawn to b5, pawn to a3, preventing this pawn from advancing anymore. Bishop to b7, takes, and this is another very common occurrence that you might see in a lot of Najdorfs, where white is giving up the bishop pair in order to create a structure where you hope in the long term it's a little bit more difficult for black to keep his king safe. And this is kind of what happens, because after pawn to f4, knight to c6, we saw Magnus trade right here, play queen to d4 in order to get castled on the queen side, and after e6, we get a position like this, where now comes rook to b8, and this is the starting point of a lot of the interesting decisions that were made in this game. So right now you can already kind of tell black has kind of the long-term advantage of having the bishop pair, but you also have a little bit of an issue with where to put the king, because the king will never truly be safe on the king side, at least if you're to castle directly or something. And you know, it's one of these balancing acts of long-term advantages for black versus kind of some nearer-term advantages for white. And white decides, perhaps out of desperation, or perhaps just out of practical play, or perhaps just he thinks this is a very good move in this position, white plays the absolutely fantastic move, knight to d5, and this is where things begin to get very interesting in this game. So knight to d5. Obviously, sacrificing an entire knight, with the goal that if you take and we take back, we've now cut the board in half, thus accentuating how weak the black king actually is. But obviously, that's an entire piece. So the real battle is, will black be able to solve the issues of the king, work his way out of this, and then just get a winning position, or will Magnus be able to keep the pressure up and be able to win this game? And let's check out the action to see exactly what happens. The bishop goes back to b7, and now comes rook to e1, bishop to e7, and you can get kind of a sense of how tied down this bishop kind of might become, and potentially that is a focal point that white would like to try to exploit. But first we see bishop to d3, connecting the rooks, getting the last piece into the game, and now after king to f8, the king is trying to get to a slightly safer square. We see g4, and white is saying, all right, let's open up the king side, let me try to get in, and potentially I can get some sort of attack against the king. Well, black decides to take, and now a very interesting move. Instead of the simple recapture, which is, I think, what a lot of people would potentially choose in this position, we saw pawn to f5, and Magnus is just saying, I'll take this pawn back in just a moment, but let me accentuate the weakness of this bishop on e7 and just how stuck it is. And the bishop maybe won't be stuck forever. Maybe in some long endgame this bishop comes back to life, but for now, that guy is he's stuck in there. He is just, he got stuffed. And that is something that you're going to need to work out. So here we see the rook coming over, defending the pawn. And now we see an interesting decision, and maybe this is the beginning of where white goes wrong. But I wouldn't 100% trust computer evaluations in these kinds of positions. When you have these super long-term advantages, usually you need to let a computer think very long sometimes even to figure out what is going on here. But Magnus decides at this moment to take on g4, and potentially this is the start of his position starting to go wrong. There was another idea here that could potentially have been played, which was rook to g3. Not only with the idea that maybe we double up and win the g-pawn, but also, if you're not careful, we swing over this way, and how exactly would you continue to defend your bishop on e7? So if we saw some move like this, black would need to consider something like rook to c7 to be able to provide more support for this bishop, and okay, the game just keeps going on, but that's not what happens. We saw white take on g4, black takes back, here comes the queen, and the problem with this line, potentially, is that black now gets to liberate the position. He's able to win this this d-pawn, and so now it's a full bishop that black is up here. White obviously has this pawn, so there's a little bit of an imbalance, and also the black king is still always going to be perpetually weak. So maybe there's still a lot of compensation here for white, but black is potentially starting to unravel the position, and after queen comes back to d4, the bishop goes in, initiating a trade. Black decides to give up one of the pawns, but now he's freeing up some attack on the queen side. We can see the rook is now on this open b file. The c file is wide open as well. Here comes the queen into b6, where she's putting some pressure on the b2 pawn. So Magnus plays pawn to b4, d5, queen to h4, and the queen is going to threaten a checkmate immediately, but also try to make some menacing threats over on the king side. So now the black king needs to try to run the other way and get to safety on the other side of the board. The queen comes in, where she's able to keep an eye on this f7 pawn. So if your king keeps marching over that way, maybe I can take her. And obviously, I also have ideas of just checking and being able to win one of the pawns back. And here's where we see queen to d6. White does decide to give the check. White does take on f7, which gives you some future ideas of using this d6 square now, potentially, either for the queen or the rook. Something is coming in, and this is the moment which I think black had a difficult time. And now, obviously, keep in mind that this is a rapid game, but potentially here, black had a very great opportunity to continue playing for a win. But Giri here, you can even see the time on the screen, has less than 1 minute, and this game ends with queen to f4, the king marches back, and we see a draw by repetition. So this game officially ended in a draw, but I still thought it was interesting and worth showing. The way that this game could have gone would have been, if black wanted to try to fight on and play for a win here, the opportunity came with this move, rook to f8, which temporarily kicks the queen away. So now she doesn't have access to this checking square on e6, and now something like pawn to a5, and black is going to target the white queen side, where if you can potentially open this up, perhaps you'll be able to get some sort of attack later in the game. And even if this rook now comes in to the e6 square, you can imagine after queen to f4, king will go somewhere. You should be able to get some sort of attack, whether it's by first coming back, defending this pawn, but now all of a sudden there are some targets over on the king side, not to mention the first rank, which is a little bit weaker, and this potentially could have given black a large opportunity to play for a win in this position. And even here at this very moment, after giving this check when they were deciding to repeat, there were even here some opportunities for black, Anish Giri, to potentially try to play for a win. For example, you can play something like rook to e8 at a moment like this, but now it's definitely not as clear because you've let the queen come into e6 if that's what you want to do, and after some move, you know, it's no longer as clear what is going on. This pawn is hanging potentially. The king can just move over here, preventing any checks, and the rook will be active along some of these ranks, plus this pawn's hanging. No longer as clear as it used to be, because you always have to calculate a few more moves, plus you're pinned. Maybe this is good for black, but, you know, could have made it a little bit more interesting. And obviously, this game ended in a draw, but if you like that, please let me know. And if there's any other games that Magnus or anybody else plays in the Crypto Cup that you would like to see analyzed, feel free to let me know in the comments below. But this is kind of an interesting, cool, freak attack. What do you think of it? Let me know. All right, I'll see you guys. Bye!